So welcome to the webinar on coronavirus with questions and answers. We've had lots of questions in over the last couple of days, and what we have done is gathered them all together and summarised them into some questions for the panellists. As I've said already, please ignore all of the webinar chat and all the Q&A, which are nothing to do with us. It is from people who don't have enough to do and obviously have some strange agenda. So we're going to kick off with some questions about IT and technology. So Steve Clark is one of the founders of Freeman Clark, and they provide fractional IT directors to ambitious and growing companies. So Steve, first question. Now our staff are at home, how can I make sure they are working effectively?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because people will have spent a lot of time getting their people at home and doing it very rapidly. But now they're at home, how do you manage their time and make sure they're efficient and effective? Well, one of the first things that we advise to do is to review the business processes and make sure they are efficient and effective. Quite often these rely on people being in the office to work properly. Now everybody's out remotely, those processes may not work anymore. Using collaboration software to improve communications, looking at document digitization, for instance, using e-sign options instead of physical documents, and make sure that you give your employees the tools that they need to work from home. Don't skimp on those, and train the management so they can lead the people rather than manage them. You have to be outcomes based rather than task based. And also check in regularly to make sure that everyone is communicating. It's very easy when you're working at home to disappear into a small little compartment all by yourself. And the chat tools that you have, for instance, Microsoft Teams or Slack, are all good ways in which you can actually encourage that communication. You're on mute, Ali, I think.
That's called trying to get no background noise. Apologies. So Steve, how do I continue to work closely with suppliers and outsourcers now I'm running a business that's made up of people working from home?
Yes, this is tough because quite often businesses are based around paper. There's still a huge amount of paper within the office environment, and you need to start moving it over to a digital or electronic operation only. You know, the last thing you want is people printing out lots of stuff, looking at it and then scanning it and sending it back or whatever. So you've got to consider making sure that the systems you have are integrated, and that's not necessarily the easiest thing to do. But you can look at middleware or check whether, if you're using standard systems, they usually have interfaces that you can link up systems to each other. And this creates an opportunity for you to grow stronger ties with suppliers as well, because if you can link directly into their systems, then it improves the speed with which you can work with them. And in addition, if you're using systems, you can start to reduce your reliance possibly on a single supplier, because you know, if you have the standard interfaces out into the rest of the world, then those standard interfaces are ones that suppliers will be supplier systems will know about and be able to link up with. So standardizing of processes also makes it easier to outsource and automate. If you have a process that everybody can work at home with, it's more likely to be easily replicable, and therefore you can look at either outsourcing that capability or you can automate it as well. You know, the combination of reducing the amount of paper that you're using and linking up with supplier and customer systems in the long run will enable you to reduce the reliance on individuals within that the business process that you have within your business.
Great, thanks, Steve. And can tech help me to sort out my operations and supply chain to deal with the current situation and also the new normal that's coming down the line?
Yes, I think they can. And I think this is where using standard off-the-shelf products, as I just talked about, with simple connectivity with other systems, makes life easier if you're going to have to readjust your supply chain. You know, we've heard of the omni-channel for content strategy, i.e., being able to work with a customer that comes in on any type of channel that we've got. But I think we're also seeing the rise of the omni-channel supply chain, with companies looking to handle supply from multiple origins. There's no longer a desire to have a single supplier of a product. People want to be able to pick and choose where they get their product from. And ERP systems need to be able to cope with the different prices of the same product supplied by different multiples. It can get quite tricky. And I think we need to remove the operating silos that exist between separate supply channels and improve the logistics across those supply channels as well. And using technology, standard technology, avoid, if you possibly can, going down bespoke product channels, because that will actually cause you more problems in the long run. Takes product off the shelf and work with it as the developer intended. And making sure that your data is consistent across your company as well. Making sure that a client or a supplier looks the same in whichever system you choose, helps you with your whole supply chain as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Steve. And what role might blockchain technology play in addressing current problems caused by centralization?
Yeah, I read this question and struggled with it for a bit, but I think there is an opportunity for blockchain to help. In a way, blockchain can provide a weaker version of a service bus that enables you to potentially integrate new suppliers into your systems much quicker than you might otherwise have done. And it enables you to potentially link up with suppliers with complex ERP systems where you don't want to integrate those ERP systems together, but you might put a layer of private blockchain on top, because it removes the need for the complex integration. I have to say, I would not even think about looking at blockchain right now, given that we're in this crisis. It's a big project, but I think in the long run, using blockchain a bit like this could have competitive advantage if it's done right. I think in a few software generations, we'll actually see blockchain as a more standard part of the business applications that we use every day.
Great. Thanks, Steve. So coming maybe to down to earth a little bit more.
Sorry.
What could I do to make sure my team are working safely from home right now with the right technology?
Yes, with the companies spread all over the place, hackers are really using this time when people are stressed and in unfamiliar territory to up their attacks. As you can see today, we've got a load of kiddie scripters using our Q&A to try and have fun. But that's just actually the fun end. The bad bit is where they're phishing and they're taking money out of your bank accounts. And this is hard when you're not in full control of the machines that you generally use. They're not in your office anymore. So firstly, you need to make sure your own security is working well. Do the best you can to make sure the security you've got is working correctly, whether it's at home or in the office. Make sure the anti-malware, the antivirus is working well, and you've got virtual private network software enabling a secure channel between the home worker and the business. And make sure everybody's trained. Yeah, the weakest link in all security is the person on the machine. It's not the technology, it's the person. So if you haven't trained your people in cybersecurity for the last 6 months or so, then really and truly the best piece of support and investment you can make in your people right now is to give them some cyber training.
Great. And then final question on tech. Am I more at risk then from a cyber attack at the moment? And is there anything I can do? Yes,
you are. And it is a fact that people will exploit the loopholes that they find, and that they will they are working very hard out there. These are proper criminals. They are organized. This is a highly profitable activity for them. They will be taking advantage. So these are times when you should be making more efforts and making sure your people are actually better equipped. I mean, simple things like giving finance permission to question every single purchase order or every single request for money to come through, maybe setting up a password for yourself when you ask somebody to pay, the finance team to pay, you set up a password that only you and finance know. and don't necessarily send that by email. So, you know, these are times when people are more vulnerable, and you should spend the time working with them and making sure that the security software that you do use is up to date.
Thanks, Steve. We had a phishing email today that from my business partner Helen that talked about unicorns and rainbows. So we knew that wasn't a real one.
Yeah, I mean, it is quite scary how good these are. That's a comedy one, but you know, you will come across ones that look exactly like yours. Now, if on most systems, you can actually set up alerts to say whether a forward has been set up on your system in email. If somebody has set up a forward that you're not aware of, so an email is forwarding out of your organization, that could be a first step of a phishing or an attack. So make sure that you're aware of forwarding of emails being set up within your email system.
Thank you, Steve. That's great. I'm going to move on now to Richard Hancock from the Marketing Centre. So the Marketing Centre provide part-time marketing directors. And Richard, we've got some questions for you. So what advice can be offered so far as to what we should be doing during this pandemic and what we should avoid doing?
Okay, thanks, Ali, and good morning, everybody. Well, I guess to market or not to market is a big question that's being faced by many of the business owners just now. It is, after all, quite an easy cut that doesn't always have a stark and immediate impact on the bottom line. And as I recall mentioning last week, it's really important to remember that short-term decisions can have long-term consequences. And in times such as these, while marketing might not drive hot leads today, it can still be a really productive time to build warm leads, loyalty and brand awareness that's going to stand us all in great stead for tomorrow. But there are some simple do's and don'ts in addition to those that I mentioned last week. And the first don't is don't keep sending out promotions, newsletters, or any form of advertising that you can't deliver against or isn't sensitive to what your customers might be going through just now. Now is not the time for aggressive sales campaigns and promotions. So if your company's marketing has traditionally been about lead generation, price promotions, think differently in these circumstances. And what you should do is refocus your marketing and communications to be much more socially minded, and do this by being a resource to current and past customers, and as well as new prospects. So keep a really close eye on what your competitors are doing. It may expose both new threats and great opportunities. We all find ourselves in these times, I think, being one way to be successful is provide information, share more insights, give more than you have previously. Also consider new pricing strategies, reductions, or payment plans that will allow your customers to stay with you during these tough times. And think about how your marketing actions today will build long-term loyalty when we begin to recover and spend again. So let the world know also that you're still around, being responsible corporate citizens and available to help. And how we're seen to behave in tough times will really help build respect, credibility, and also trust. And in an environment where competitors might be very quiet, our share of voice will grow, and so will our opportunity to build brand awareness.
Thanks, Richard. That's a really great message about sort of generosity and paying it forward, which feels really appropriate at the moment. So here's a question that's been asked. My current business is being severely disrupted by current events. What should I do to find new markets?
Well, a number of you have asked this question and similar questions. So a great starting point is to ask your existing customers how you can help them and what they may want. Ask them what new challenges they're facing. You can then see how you might be able to adapt to address these. Also ask past customers and prospects, even those you may have thought were fully embedded with a competitor. It may be that others in your market are so busy firefighting internally or battening down the hatches that they are ignoring or incapable of serving the needs of their existing clients. So by offering help and being sensitive to the messaging you use, you must, of course, avoid being perceived as being a vulture exploiting the situation.
Yeah.
But if your traditional markets are struggling, sit down with your marketing and leadership teams and take stock of what you do really well and think creatively and laterally about which other markets might benefit from what you have. And it may not necessarily be the obvious things, such as your current products or services. It may be that your team skills, your customer database, supply chain, distribution network, traffic that you get to your website, Think of anything that could be leveraged to open up new opportunities, often through forming new partnerships or collaborations. There've already been, and we've seen it all in the press, great examples of businesses repurposing themselves really quickly. You know, for example, we've seen the car makers have already shipped thousands of respirators. And on a really tiny scale, my own golf club is already consolidating food orders from the community, leveraging their suppliers, their F&B, food and drink suppliers, and making home deliveries, not just for the benefit of the members, but also to frontline workers and the vulnerable. Just a tiny example. But some of you have also asked about how to enter into unfamiliar new markets. And here, start with developing an understanding of the key issues being faced by the people you want to target. Get inside their heads and the problems you think you can solve, and then articulate that proposition in a way that addresses these needs. And once you've done that, you need to set about finding them. And a lot of you have got B2B companies. So in this case, draw up a target list of companies. LinkedIn is a great way of finding the right people to talk to. There are also lots of data sources that you can buy, and obvious places such as Google Trends is a great resource to look at what people are searching for right now. Very different to what they were searching for just a few weeks ago. And in the case of B2C companies, there are loads of tools that make targeted marketing really possible. And many of them will be very much more affordable now than they were a few months ago. And just to take one example, Sky, who we know very well, have a product called AdSmart that from as little as a couple of £1,000 can enable you to target TV ads to specific consumer profiles, right down to postcodes if needed. And they do that by linking, getting data from all the shopping habits through data they get from store cards, and they cross-reference that with the viewing habits of Sky boxes. So data from every Sky Q box is sent back to Sky, and they cross-reference that with the store card information. It's really scary stuff, but really helpful for targeting. And of course, we have the Liberty Group. So within the Liberty Group, we've got a fantastic network of people and businesses that we work with. So feel free to use it. Let us know what types of business you'd like to be introduced to, and we'll do our very best to help if we can. And it's just worth mentioning that many new business models and dominant market positions have evolved from an agile response to a crisis such as this.
Thanks, Richard. So final question about marketing. What should I be doing to prepare my business to grow again when this is all over?
Well, once we can plug the holes in the dam, the dust will undoubtedly settle, and we will accumulate new learnings from trying new ways to manage our businesses. We can also be certain of one thing. The environment within which we used to run our business will never be exactly the same again. I wouldn't mind betting, for example, that the square footage devoted to bricks and mortar retail will shrink dramatically over the coming years, as thousands of shoppers are forced to experience online shopping for the very first time. And similarly, I wouldn't want to be an investor in high-end central London office space as remote working becomes more widely accepted. And right now, while we've got, or we will have the time over the coming weeks, it's vital that our leadership teams devote time and energy to planning Life PC post-corona. And I would always recommend a structured process that reappraises what it is that your business does really well, what your new target markets are, that may be the same or new ones that you've discovered recently. What are your routes to market? And for example, please feel free to look at our Marketing 360 on our website. This contains the building blocks or scaffold around which you can review your business model and marketing strategy to set about finding, winning and keeping clients in the new world. We do this at the Marketing Centre all the time, so if you want any help, just feel free to ask us. And I would advise starting this as soon as possible, so that you've got a clear strategy and plan and can be one of the first out of the blocks when we come through this. Gaps will appear in the market. Clients will have new opportunities and requirements, and marketing costs will generally be lower. So there will be opportunities in abundance in many sectors. So I just, on a positive note, I'll just finish with a quote. I think it was Andy Grove from Intel, he was CEO at Intel. He observed, bad companies are destroyed by crisis, good companies survive them, and great companies are improved by them.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Richard.
Thank you.
So we're going to move on to the area of finance, not a small one at the moment, but we've got a few questions for our experts. So I'm going to start by introducing Neville Durrant from the FD Centre. Hi, Nev. You can unmute, hopefully. So our first question is, what are the expected economic impacts, recession, the banking sector, etc.? Will it be like 2008, 2009?
Okay, so I'll just start off by talking about globally, and we've seen some pretty unprecedented times, really. We've seen the biggest one-day decline in the stock markets since 1987. We saw earlier in March, we saw the record filings for unemployment in the US. We've seen big movements in commodity prices. Even things like gold have been very variable. Normally you see those as a safe investment at times like this, but the price of gold dipped and then recovered. Chinese industrial production fell by 13.5% in January and February. And that's had a big impact on supply chains around the world. So all those, the real answers we don't know, but all those things put together, many of the sort of mainstream forecasts are actually forecasting a big global slowdown. And the OECD forecast at the moment is saying that the global economy will go its lowest level since 2009, which is the last really big crisis. They have a worst case scenario, which actually sees the world economy go into recession, but that is seen at the moment as being an outside scenario rather than one that they're considering. Boiling that down to the UK, in the UK, what we're expecting at the moment is a 2.3% decline in GDP. So we're going to go into recession. That level is dependent on us getting control of the virus. If we don't, it could be as bad as 5% decline, which will put us back in line with what happened in 2008, 2009. Either way, the analysts are predicting a sharp recovery in 2021. So that is the good news, that it will bounce back relatively quickly. But for the remainder of this year, what we will see is we will see unemployment rise. Some of the projections I've seen say about 5.6% is where unemployment might get to, but come back off that fairly quickly. There'll be a big decline in investment, no surprise there, lots of uncertainty. Talking about the banking system, which you mentioned, Ali, generally speaking, commentators are saying that the US, European banks are well capitalized and not particularly vulnerable. There are some exceptions to that, where the current crisis and potential defaults that arise from the crisis on loans will put some banks that were already vulnerable into difficulty. But really, we're talking about banks in Italy and Greece at this point. In the European Union, those look quite vulnerable. And there's concern as a result of that of what the European Central Bank might have to do. UK banks generally have been all stress test and are fairly resilient. The question really about the banking sector for me at the minute is, will they be a help? I don't think there's going to be a run on the banks, but will they actually help solve the problem? And we might come on to that in a minute. In terms of housing market, we were looking at a fairly uncertain half in the second half of this year anyway because of Brexit. What we're going to see now is we will see a decline in demand. We're also going to see a contraction in supply of new builds. So where the market actually ends up, it just feels like it's going to be very sluggish, and values may fall a bit across 2020. There's obviously quite a lot of pressure in the system for new builds, so you might see a very rapid pickup in 2021. And that's my rundown of the economy at the moment. Is that you don't really know, but those are sort of where people are guessing at the moment.
Thanks, Nev. That's fantastic. So let's talk about this coronavirus business interruption loan, because I know lots of business owners have been struggling with accessing it, and there was more information yesterday. Can you talk us through the general experience on applications? How are banks behaving?
Yeah, so there's lots of details on this scheme on the British Business Bank. So if you're not that familiar with it, you can look there. It's very good summary. There have been lots of problems accessing funds. That's come across from some of our clients as well. We've seen that. What has been happening is the banks have taken their own interpretation of the scheme and made it fairly hard for people to get a loan. So each bank's different, but if I took a sort of midpoint of what the main high street banks have been doing, they've been saying if you want a loan from 25,000 to 100,000, you need to secure that on some sort of short form guarantee. If you want from 100,000 to $250,000, you need the short form guarantee, and we want a debenture. And if you want a loan over $250,000 up to the 5 million limit, we want a personal guarantee for the 20% that the government's not guaranteeing. We want a debenture, and we possibly want some security around tangible assets. Now, interestingly, that is not what the scheme was set up to do. And it's really at odds with some of the stated objectives of the scheme. So what we have heard, and we're going to hear more, I think maybe today, maybe tomorrow, is that the Treasury and the Chancellor have been in talk with the major banks, because they want to step in and remove the requirement where banks are, at the moment, the banks have to assess the loan case on commercial terms first, and if it doesn't qualify commercial terms, they're putting it across into this scheme. And the government are going to remove that first step requirement. So effectively, you go straight into the coronavirus business interruption loan scheme. The second thing we're hearing is that for loans up to $250,000, banks are going to be told or asked or lent on to remove the personal guarantee for the 20% that the government's not guaranteeing. One thing I would say is that banks have interpreted this in different ways, and some have tried to use this to get some sort of leverage in the market and potentially steal a bit of a march on other banks. So I know that Lloyds, for instance, have not been requiring personal guarantees on these loans. So there is some value here in shopping around and trying to find banks that are not being quite so draconian about the requirements. The one thing I don't know yet, and I haven't been able to find out, is whether Lloyds are extending that to new customers or if they're just extending to their current customers. But it's definitely worth checking that out. So we will hear more in the probably next 48 hours on what's happening on this. The pattern so far has been it's very difficult to get into these loans, and it's just effectively it's just like trying to get a commercial loan at the minute, and the security and the personal guarantees are preventing people from accessing them.
I imagine all the banks aren't particularly well set up for everyone to work from home as well, so they're probably struggling with some of the issues we've already been talking about on this call. It's not particularly easy for anyone, is it, at the moment? No,
there is confusion out there. I've seen emails from relationship managers at HSBC who believe that the debenture requirements come from government, and clearly it hasn't. So there's some internal confusion within the banks as well.
Thanks, Nev. That's appreciated. So that was Nev from the FD Centre, and we're going to move on to Jane Ryan at Your Right Hand Finance team, who provide part-time bookkeepers and financial managers, financial controllers. Jane, I've got a really practical question for you here. Credit control. How do we get as much money in as quickly as possible?
Yeah, morning Ali, morning everyone. That is a great question. We would say follow your usual credit control process. If that is not ringing a bell with you, we have got a process template we can send you, best practice around credit control and how to run that. So do ask if you want that. In general, if your clients and customers are saying that they're going to have difficulty paying, the best thing probably to do is try and set up a payment arrangement with them. I think Steve mentioned this earlier on. It's better to try and get some small amounts of money regularly rather than go after the whole bill straight away. We would recommend that you try and get those payments in weekly if you can, rather than finding out at the end of the month that they're not going to pay any of it. If they refuse to pay, you can follow normal recourse, which at this point usually is going to the small claims court. Just be aware that those courts are going to be shut down soon, so that is going to not become an option. The best thing to do is just keep talking to your customers and clients. You know, we are all in this together, and hopefully they will actually find a way to make some small payments to you, especially if you're a small business, smaller than them. The other thing we would mention is just don't let the debt get any bigger. So don't do any work for credit. Maybe make sure that you get payment up front.
Great, thank you so much, Jane. So we're going to move on. Before the when we put the webinar out, there were lots of questions around people and legal and furloughs. So we're going to move on to some of those questions now. So I'm going to introduce Sharon Brigland-Goff from People Puzzles. Hi, Sharon. You need to unmute, by the way, Sharon. So People Puzzles provide part-time HR directors as part of this group of businesses. So Sharon, what should be the practical process for furlough?
Yeah, so the process is really important because furlough is effectively alternative to redundancy. So it needs to be a fair process, and particularly if you're only placing a proportion of your organisation on furlough. What we'd obviously advise you to do first of all is really think about things. What's immediately you need to support existing clients and continue to run your business? And what does that mean for your workforce right now? And if time's going to get tougher before they get better, what else may you need to do? Do you need to furlough some more people? And also then think about actually, if the busy, how quickly can you get your business back up and running when things are through, and does that impact your choice? So first of all, plan. The second thing then is once you really have understood that and you've got your plan, is you need to decide which roles you're going to furlough and which ones you're not. So the first thing we recommend you do is look for volunteers. There may be some workers who will be quite happy to be volunteered to be furloughed, although there's no automatic right to it. There may be people with caring responsibilities, etc. But be careful if you are going to select people in forced furlough, because you can't obviously automatically select those with caring responsibilities. So if your volunteer route doesn't address or fully address your furlough requirements, you will need to follow some form of selection criteria, very similar to redundancy selection. So first of all, identify the pool of individuals to be assessed, and this should be employees carrying out similar roles, same or similar roles in the business where the work is reducing due to the coronavirus outbreak, and where normally you would have had to adopt a redundancy process. Score each individual, again using a scoring mechanism, so it could cover things like productivity, output, attitude, technical ability, and if you're looking at the manager group, thinking about something connected to do with their management skills. So where your team is then reducing by 1, you take the lowest scoring, by 2, take the next one, and so on and so on and so on. And then after that, look at that furloughed employee and look at any other considerations that you may have to give to them in terms of the personal circumstances. And is there already a known desire that they want to be furloughed? And then you should consult and seek agreement with the identified employees. And once you've got that verbal agreement, make sure you confirm things in writing, because obviously going on furlough leave is a contractual change. Ali, you're on mute.
Thank you, Sharon. That's really practical. So some people might be going on furlough, but then also some people might be either reducing hours or taking a salary cut. Yeah. So what's the process for reducing hours or reducing income?
Yeah. So again, in effect, you're actually making a change to the contract of employment, and you will need to go through some form of consultation process before you impose any change. There may also, you may actually have a short-term working clause in your contract or a variation clause in your contract, and you can potentially rely on those clauses. But in terms of practical terms or the process to follow, the first thing we would recommend that you do is hold an organisational wide briefing to share with all employees the impact of coronavirus situation and what that means for your business. So talking about the proposed changes you may want to make, like reducing hours and how much you would want to reduce hours, and potentially when that would then come to an end. And following on from that, we recommend that you talk with all employees individually before deciding to make a change. We should really aim to do that on a one-to-one basis. And that can be done virtually. We've been working with lots of clients that way around. And in that conversation, the line manager would really need to explain the reason behind the change, invite employees to talk about concerns or alternative suggestions that they may actually have, really listen to concerns and understand their ideas, and gather together that feedback and consider any alternatives that people may have proposed. Now, assuming people actually accept those changes, and because it's a change of term, you must confirm the changes in writing as a variation to the employee's written terms. It's hugely important. And in that letter, include the fact that the change is temporary and when the situation is going to be reviewed. It would be really important also to advise in that letter under the circumstances which could result in the change actually continuing, i.e. continuation of the government measures. And actually, during that temporary period of reduction, keep everybody up to date on what is actually happening. And if you do have to extend that period, I would recommend that you have further brief one-to-one conversations again, just to ensure that everybody's understood and they are still in agreement, and again, then reissue the letter to say you're extending it.
Great, thanks, Sharon. So consultation and agreement is really important, and
Yeah.
Steve mentioned earlier that we can get people to sign documents electronically. So that often, well, certainly at this time, is really useful and actually good for going forwards as well. So what about people on maternity? Does furlough affect maternity pay arrangements?
Okay, so if you've got someone due to go on to maternity leave, they will revert to being on maternity leave at the date they have been given as the start of the maternity leave or the birth, whatever is the sooner. And when they go on to that, they then have to receive their usual statutory and contractual maternity and pay entitlements. I think one of the important things to bear in mind though with this, if somebody's on furlough leave during the reference period, which is used to calculate their SMP, their earnings during the furlough leave period will be used to calculate that rate. So this may mean they could end up on a lower SMP rate than they would have done normally if they had actually not been furloughed.
There's all sorts of things in the news about people going on maternity at the moment. It doesn't seem like a perfect time to have a baby, I have to say.
No, it isn't.
So what about annual leave arrangements? Can I force people to take annual leave at the moment? Can they carry it over?
Yeah, again, it's a really good question. So in terms of forcing annual leave, you need to make sure that you give the right amount of notice as set out in your employee contracts or your handbooks. This is usually double the amount of annual leave that the person you're asking them to actually take, and there is actually that requirement in law as a minimum. So for example, if you want people to take 5 days, you need to give them 10 days notice of when you wish them to take that. But I would really ask people to think very, very carefully about this, as there could be a potential risk of a claim for breach of the implied terms of mutual trust and confidence if an employer forces an employee to take holiday during the government imposed lockdown period. And that's based on an argument really that the employer is acting unreasonably in forcing holiday to be taken at a time when the employee is not really able to reasonably rest and enjoy themselves. I think in terms of the carryover of annual leave, the working time regulations have now actually been amended to allow workers to have the right to carry forward their untaken statutory holiday for 2 years. So that's the minimum holiday entitlement, where it's not been reasonably practical to take the leave due to the coronavirus pandemic. The guidance originally did actually say key workers. When the guidance came out last week, it said key workers, but the statutory instrument has clarified that by saying workers and effectively categorise everybody. What we'd encourage you to do is for the employer and employees should discuss with each other and both be reasonable about what to carry over. I'm absolutely sure that some would be really happy to be flexible around holidays and do what's best in the best interest of the business. And when the holidays are then taken, it's on the usual business need as you would normally to take it. And then one of the final things, just to clarify around bank holidays during the furlough and what to pay, because furlough is a change to contract on reduced pay, and thus you pay 80%. You don't put somebody back on 100% for the bank holidays. It's at that 80% of whilst they're being paid on furlough leave.
Great, thank you, Sharon. Okay, final question. Have you got any quick tips for us on remote working from an HR perspective?
From HR perspective, so Steve covered up a really good number of things. I think the first key thing I would say is about communications and finding those opportunities to continue to be a team. You know, as a leader, it's really also important to be visible and engaging regularly. And that means more than an email. It means using the technology. It means engaging daily, weekly, monthly with the whole team, and using the technology to keep people updated about business and the business performance and the direction the business is going in. You know, one of the things really important is to continue to unite people around the core business purpose and values, because it brings that stability back to people who've had everything upset, and we want people to be as stable as possible. Continue with people leadership where you can. So continue those one-to-ones, but do them remotely. But absolutely look out for signs of issues around physical and mental well-being. Provide support where it needs to be, and continue with the usual things: your end-of-year reviews, engagement surveys, and don't be worried about doing engagement surveys right now. Yes, there may be a dip, but it shows you're listening, and it enables you to think about the action plans when we come out of this as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sharon. Right, we're moving on to our 7th expert. So this is Sinan Zhu from My In-House Lawyer. Hi there. Great, you're there. Fantastic. So we've got My In-House. Do I sound like a robot to anyone else? Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that. My In-House Lawyer provide senior level in-house counsel to businesses who need extra legal support in-house. So first question, what's the legal view on the performance of external contracts at this time?
Yeah, so I think that's a question commonly asked, and many people are facing the same issues. I mean, really, you know, this goes by, and a lot of people are already been talking about force majeure. That's probably at the tip of a lot of people's, you know, tongue all the time. So contract still holds, in short, unless parties have contractual rights to terminate. So this is your, you know, get out of jail card in the contract, whether it's a force majeure provision or something more, you know, specific. And because force majeure is, you know, a provision used to say if there's an event that will make the performance of your contractual obligation impossible or extremely difficult, then you're discharged effectively from your obligations. In practice, what we suggest for people to do is to first check in your contract, is there a force majeure provision? And secondly, to see whether the force majeure definition included a pandemic, you know, to cover the current situation. Even if it's not specifically referred to, often because the description of force majeure events is to say whether it's events beyond both parties' control, that may already be sufficient. But all very well, even if it's covered in the force majeure definition, the more important thing is to check, which is the third thing you need to check, is how that force majeure provision will operate. Sometimes the provision may say, if this event will prevent you from performance of your contract, that sets the bar quite high. So just because the performance of the contract becomes more difficult, more onerous, more expensive, doesn't necessarily discharge you from that obligation. It really has to make the performance of your obligation impossible and practicable. But sometimes the wording may be if you know, the event will hinder or delay the performance, that perhaps give you a little more flexibility if the, you know, performance of the contract becomes too onerous and too difficult, that can still be applied. So then once you establish there is a force majeure provision and it, you know, has kicked in for your purpose, the more important thing is, the last thing you need to check is what is the consequence. So in the contract, often if it's silent, that probably just give people, as I mentioned earlier, get out of jail card. People can claim against you in terms of breach of contract because you've been discharged in terms of your contractual obligation. But many contracts often will be more specific about that. For example, it might say, if the force majeure situation continues for a certain period of time, 3 months, you can actually terminate the contract and you provide a refund. But sometimes it might actually give people a little more room to renegotiate. What we see in practice, and I think, you know, all very well the legal position, so we all understand, but really in practice, this is what most the contractual parties are doing, and we advise a lot of clients in terms of renegotiating the terms of their contracts, because you still got to look at your long-term relationship with your business partners, sustainability of the business, and you want to be sensible and cooperative, so when, you know, this is all over, we will still have a good business circle and community to come back to. A lot of more innovative solutions are being, you know, suggested as well. Maybe you give people a paid holiday, but in exchange for a longer contractual period being locked in with your customer, or you may offer, instead of refund, a credit to be applied or potential discount if people are willing to commit, maybe moving down the timeline, just, you know, when they take delivery or when they require your service. So lots to think about. And last thing I would say is, which is sort of not necessarily contractual legal, is definitely worth checking your insurance policy. If you have business disruption insurance, check anything there that could help you.
Great, thank you very much. So what's the legal stance on refunding customers for cancelled events due to COVID-19? Can we push for a postponement or credit rather than a refund? Can you give us some insight?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question, because it's sort of, you know, we talked about force majeure, which is a contractual position. This is almost a subcategory of the type of contract because it's a B2C contract. Therefore, the force majeure principles, the legal principles we talked about just now still would apply, but also in addition, you need to look at two things. One is, in most B2C contract, because it's not, you know, like your B2B contract, it's a negotiated contract. It is understood, both parties read the contract and the terms are clear. With B2C, often these are standard terms, which most people don't read and just click accept. So under common law, you need to establish the term has been effectively incorporated into the contract, whatever you think that is. So in this particular question, I think they asked, you know, in our standard terms, we have the force majeure, and we can just try to postpone or give a credit rather than give the refund. Then, so first of all, we need to establish, do you think that term has been effectively incorporated in the contract? And that would include things like, and generally in law, the principle is more onerous the term is, more specific you need to be. If it's just embedded in, you know, 10 pages of small print terms and conditions, that might be difficult. But if it's something you've highlighted to the customers in the first instance, or it is actually commonly accepted practice in the industry. For example, in the event space, it's not unusual for there to be a term to say, well, we might have to, due to factors out of our control, we may have to postpone the event, and we can offer you another date with similar experience. And then once that's established, you need to look at the Consumer Rights Act, whether the term is considered fair. And whether the term is considered fair, or even before whether terms effectively incorporate, these are all question of facts. So very much depending on, you know, what you're offering, what type of events it is, for example. But generally, under law, how you consider whether it's fair is you say, are you putting that term in good faith? Does it cause significant imbalance between parties' rights and obligations? I mentioned comparable events and experience before. For example, if it's an outdoor event that was going to be held in summer, if you are just saying I'm postponing, but it's going to be the same event in winter, is that really fair? So it is a question of fact. You got to judge. You got to make your judgment in terms of whether that works. But in terms of practical, you know, solutions, I would suggest you need to look at two things. One is, if you're an event promoter, often your contract is not necessarily with the consumers directly, because you may have a ticketing agent, you know, Ticketmaster, Eventbrite, etc. A lot of these big ticketing agents. So event promoter typically have a contract with the ticketing agent, and the ticketing agent has their standard terms when people go on their website and book contracts. So they have a book tickets, so they have a contract with the consumer directly. So as the event promoter, you need to look at what the terms are between you and the ticketing agent. And then if you're a ticketing agent, you look at what the terms are between you and the consumer. And secondly, I think a default position would be, you know, to offer a refund if your terms and conditions are clear and it is fair, it is effectively incorporated in the contract. You can offer to reschedule it or to apply a credit. What's interesting, and I've seen, I think that's quite well done, is to get the messaging right, because in this situation, everybody's understanding a lot of things has to change, has to be postponed. And if you get the messaging right, people who choose to book your event are in that community who share the common interest. It is about gaining their support and understanding as well. So maybe you offer them the option to take a refund, but if they choose to continue the booking or take credit, maybe you give them priority in the next booking, or you give them a discount. So all that kind of mechanism can be used to encourage collaboration, but also to give you the cash flow and flexibility you need to continue the business.
Brilliant, thank you. So let's talk about duty of care next. How do we determine the right level of duty of care to our employees whilst maintaining our business viability? So what about our publicly facing staff? What are our responsibilities if they fall ill?
So, I mean, this obviously is a very common concern to all the businesses that continue to open, especially the ones who will find it difficult in terms of social distancing, and the staff still need to travel and facing, a general public situation such as, supermarket, or if it's a takeaway business. Generally, in law, employers obviously own a duty of care to their employees under the Health and Safety Act, and there's common law duty to take reasonable care in terms of the health and safety of their workforce as far as reasonably practicable. And what we recommend for the employers to do in this situation is to have to go through that exercise and document it properly to demonstrate you've looked into this, you've done the risk assessment, because there are 2 risk assessments required. One is how likely the adverse event is to occur. 2 is if it were to occur, how bad it is. Now, we all know in this situation, it is very likely to occur because it's highly contagious. And if it does occur, in terms of how serious the consequence this is, yes, there is an element of individuality, because it very much depends on the individual condition. You have the vulnerable group. Therefore, the employers should definitely first identify who are the vulnerable employees and give them very special treatment in terms of measures they need to take to ensure these people are safe. Once you've carried out the risk assessment, you need to look at what is the reasonable step to be expected of employer in this situation to provide the protection in terms of health and safety for their employees. A good example, and if you look at, interestingly, if you observe the supermarket practice, some may have issued gloves and masks and other protection gears, and some may not have. If you look at the government guidelines, they are saying if you don't have symptoms, it's not necessary to wear masks. Therefore, it is not unreasonable for employer to also follow that stance, but you have to monitor on a continuous basis, because that advice may be changing over time as well. And the World Health Organization is doing another, I think, research, and they're going to publish their findings soon, and apparently that may change the advice on wearing face masks or not. But it's a good example demonstrator that what an employer needs to do in this situation to continuously monitor what's the right thing, issuing their health briefings that provide adequate hand sanitizer, protection gear, but also setting up the work arrangement in such a way, if you are doing a delivery or food takeaway service, making sure you put furniture in place where people have to observe the social distancing. You issue notice to people who does your delivery, for example, making sure they observe the same rules, so that doesn't put signs on the door, even as simple as that, so they don't impose on your employees who may potentially feel threatened in terms of being infected. Yeah, but I would say bottom line is, if you think really that becomes too dangerous, unless it's essential, unless it's key worker, make the operation, need to pause.
Yeah, it's hard, isn't it? Because I think most businesses are heeding the government's advice, which is to keep businesses going if at all possible, and obviously to close down the ones on the government list that cannot be open at this time, but then really thinking cleverly about taking those alternative measures to keep everybody as safe as possible is absolutely the right thing to do. Now, again, I'd like to apologise to everybody on the webinar that we can't take questions through the chat at the moment. We have had some unusual and unacceptable comments posted on there today, so we just closed the chat down. So we're going to bring the webinar to a close now, but what I'd like to offer to all of you is that if you had a question that you couldn't ask today, that we will definitely make a list of them, and we will make sure that the right expert answers each question and sends you back a personalised reply. So please do email your questions into us. We will we'll send that email address round to all the people who registered for the webinar. And I just want to thank everybody who's been on the webinar today. So thank you so much to Steve from Freeman Clark. Freeman Clark provide part-time and fractional IT directors. Thank you to Richard Hancock from the Marketing Centre, who provide part-time marketing directors. To Neville Durrant from the FD Centre, who provide part-time FDs. To Jane Ryan from Your Right Hand, provide part-time financial controllers and finance managers. To Sharon Brigland Goff from People Puzzles, who provide part-time HR directors and people directors. And from Zinan Zhu from My In-House Lawyer, who provide expert and senior in-house counsel. You'll notice there's a part-time theme. That is the theme of the Liberty Group. We all help businesses that are ambitious, that want to grow, that want to you know, continue and survive through this coronavirus pandemic and come out the other side and quickly recover and grow to be really strong businesses again. I've been Ali Morn from People Puzzles as well. So thank you so much for joining us. And as I said, please do feel free to send in any individual questions, which we will do our best to answer. Thanks for spending your hour on the webinar today. Bye-bye.